We are living in a time of the greatest wealth gap in history. Billionaires who are richer than anyone has ever been, literally wielding powers on par with countries. Sometimes that power has big impacts that people cheer. There are billionaires who've made some of the largest charitable donations in world history to help the poor, fund health care. Others have bought entire institutions. When Jeff Bezos first bought the Washington Post over a decade ago, there were many people in journalism and in sort of the nonpartisan fact community that said that was a good thing. And the Post leaned in, touting its role as a newspaper holding the Trump administration accountable, even buying, do you remember this, a pricey Super Bowl ad in 2018. Now, you might be thinking newspapers are usually pleading for donations or offering you a mug or a tote bag to buy to subsidize them. And by the way, I encourage you to consider doing that if you like your local paper. But they don't usually buy the most expensive ad space of the year. But again, they had that billionaire owner. And here was that ad's mantra. Democracy dies in darkness. And Bezos, in that era, spoke out against exactly how Trump was demonizing the free press.
It's really dangerous to demonize the media. It's dangerous to call the media lowlifes. It's dangerous to say that they're the enemy of the people. We live in a society where it's not just the laws of the land that protect us. We do have freedom of press. It's in the Constitution. But it's also the social norms that protect us. It works because we believe those words on that piece of paper. And every time you attack that, you're eroding it a little bit around the edges.
That was dangerous, he said. And Bezos knew his business empire would still have to deal with the United States government under President Trump. The Post held strong, and while it insisted on a nonpartisan approach, it wasn't against any single party. The nature of Trump's agenda, his attacks on the rule of law and democracy and facts, right, tested how top news outlets would face that extremism. And the Post didn't shirk. Bezos had the Post's back with that slogan we mentioned, democracy dies in darkness. He said there's an important role in making sure there is light against that. And Trump took his beef with the journalists. He escalated to the front office, as he does. He wanted to punish the owner, Bezos, for being involved with the Washington Post. And he also clearly wanted to send a threat, a message to other rich and powerful people through this process. We'll come back to that in a moment tonight. But very quickly it became clear Trump hates Amazon were the headlines, reporting on Trump's goal to abuse power to go after Amazon. That's according to 5 direct sources they had. Trump's obsessed with Amazon, a source said. Obsessed. This wasn't just idle talk. Trump used his government power, took measures to go after the businesses tied to the press that reported on him. What we know is what has been revealed. There may be other efforts we don't, but there are headlines and fact-check reports about him trying to punish CNN by imposing the merger of its corporate parent. That ultimately passed, or denying billions that Amazon was maybe going to get from government contracts. That's according to one lawsuit about Trump's vendettas. In the last campaign, which we all lived through, Trump only got more explicit. Retribution for perceived foes. And so Bezos, even before Election Day, clearly saw all this, what I just showed you, fought what he would have called the good fight back in the first term, and made a shift. And there are new developments on this today. For Bezos, gone were the vows to defend the Post no matter what, or to affirm that mantra for democracy. Bezos actually jumped into the editorial side. This was in the campaign homestretch. You probably remember some of it, to change their practice and eliminate any presidential endorsement in 24. An unusual move which suggested Bezos was taking this new tack. Now, in fairness, I want to make sure you understand all sides of the story. He claimed that the endorsement shift had nothing to do with Trump. But the action yanked the planned Harris endorsement, which broke practice. And so to many, it looked like a signal to Trump that Bezos would be able to at least take some actions at the Post, maybe not hand editing every story, but some actions to appease Trump, to quiet some of the Washington Post activity which Trump opposed or viewed as critical. Now, I want to be very simple and clear here. The point is not that the endorsement itself would somehow shape that election. Very few people think national newspaper endorsements are the final thing that shifts undecideds in swing states. And Trump has never gotten many of those endorsements. Meanwhile, he's still won the election twice, once outright and once through the Electoral College. The point was that Bezos was using the Post differently in a way that would appeal to Trump. And that while Bezos denied that goal, he would say that it wasn't the reason. His own reporters and editors saw it that way. And they're the ones with inside knowledge about how things work. And they were so concerned, some of them took the type of professional and economic risk that Bezos and these other billionaires are not taking, resigning their jobs over this journalistic incident. Bezos said that stopping that planned Harris endorsement had nothing to do with Trump and Harris, that it was an unusual late October shift, but it was designed to improve the Washington Post's credibility. He wrote that presidential endorsements create a perception of bias. And as for appealing to Trump, no quid pro quo of any kind is at work. Neither campaign nor candidate was consulted or informed. Okay. But there was no allegation of a formal quid pro quo, and I mean, this is not an impeachment probe. And newspaper owners can do what they want. There was also no allegation that Bezos was going to tell Trump in advance. Everyone was going to find out when this happened, including Trump, when you yanked the endorsement. The actual objection from those top Post journalists, some of them now former employees, was that Bezos was forbidding the paper from what it usually does for one reason: to warm up to Trump in the context of all of the business pressure. Now, that controversy went on and on. Now there's new evidence on what Bezos' business empire is doing, because they've made a new $1 million donation to Trump's inaugural committee. That's the kind of support and message that doesn't happen without Bezos. You can see the Wall Street Journal, which knows business, very clearly says Bezos' Amazon will donate this $1 million to Trump's inauguration. And the billionaire, in a recent interview with Andrew Ross Sorkin, went out of his way to double down on, and I'm showing you this all now because we know more now than when this happened in October, to double down on the very perception that he claimed he opposed in the clash over Bezos yanking the Harris endorsement. And it's a lot more money than Amazon gave in 2016, which was around $57,000. So many, many other orders of magnitude this time, which looks different. And now Bezos says he's optimistic about Trump and his leadership. And he also says in his warming up to Trump something that we don't hear much even from Trump's aides, and I've interviewed a lot of them over the years. Bezos says America is witnessing a changed new Trump, a calm and settled leader.
If we're talking about Trump, I think it's very interesting. I'm actually very optimistic this time around. You've probably grown in the last 8 years. He has too. He is calmer than he was first time and more confident, more settled.
There you have that. Bezos is one very important businessman who chose to enter this fray with the Washington Post purchase. But the point tonight is not even to just fixate on him or the link to journalism, because this is much broader. Consider that Trump's many attacks on democracy and the FBI are often seen first in the context of law and politics, like his recent claims about sending political opponents or political critics to go to jail. But the same autocratic issues come up in business. And this is a trend we've seen in many countries where any leader can wield unchecked power. It affects business first and foremost, because all around the world people need money, and a lot of people want more money than they have. So now we're seeing some of the richest, most powerful business leaders rush to fold, including tech leaders who often pride themselves in their public remarks and their entire branded lives as being smart and independent and having visionary plans beyond the way things used to work or the old government routines, let alone giving in to brash efforts to intimidate them. But some of them are already folding, and if they are, what message does this send to everybody else who certainly doesn't have their money and lawyers and networks of support? You see the faces here, some of them famous. Mark Zuckerberg shifting gears to cozy up to Trump following the Elon Musk school. Others might be less known by their face. Google CEO Sundar Pichai was joining his own company employees' protests in the first Trump era. What a different time that was. You think about when people say, well, this isn't politics or this isn't partisan, there's right and wrong, or you have to stand up. And as the leader of a company, sometimes there are issues that come up where your own employees say, how can we even work here if you won't stand up? And it was in that context that the Google CEO stood up against one of Trump's first acts in government, the travel ban.
There are some values which are really near and dear to your heart. It's foundational and something which you should never compromise on. And the fight will continue. So that's
Google's leader going from what he said right there, quote, never compromise, that against the travel ban in year one of Trump, to now making the trip to Mar-a-Lago, even amidst planned mass deportations, which at a numerical level could affect far more immigrants and people who are in this country or trying to come and go into this country than the original travel ban on which he said he'd never compromise. Another leader, CEO Mark Benioff, opposed Trump in 2016. Now he says he sees great promise for Trump's America. Or take one of the newest tech heroes, the artificial intelligence pioneer Sam Altman, who is, by all accounts, a brilliant person. We've even had some of his employees on this program to explore the visionary field of AI. But I want to remind you something that he might not want you to know. Maybe you can find it in ChatGPT. In 2016, he said Trump was an unacceptable threat to America, unfit to be president. Now, he would have you believe the threat has become the solution. And Altman says that Trump is a great leader to take us into the age of AI. He knows money talks. And he went even beyond the company coffers and made a personal donation of $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund. The richest, most powerful business titans. On record, some of them warning about Trump's danger, even spending years in what they called the good fight. Some warning about his abuse of power to silent dissent and corrupt systems, ranging from a free press to a free market. And what we're seeing now is that they are bending. They are doing what author Tim Snyder warns against, obeying in advance. And so with everything else going on, we ask tonight, what does this portend for the Trump second term? And does reporting the truth about it even matter? And that answer is simple. Of course it does. It's precisely the power of truth, of facts, of reporting, especially when powerful forces are not held accountable by other dynamics, that makes this such a big story. It's why Jeff Bezos bought the Post. It's why Trump wants to control these forces, the press, and the people who might be subjected to learn some facts about him or his government, past, present, or future. It's why your knowledge of these facts matters, even in an environment where there's a heck of a lot of money swirling around between some people eating their own words, because they used to warn against the very efforts to stifle dissent and facts that they are now joining.
Just days before Donald Trump's nominee to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., heads to Capitol Hill to kickstart his confirmation process. Brand new reporting reveals that one of his aides has been waging war against one of the miracles of modern medicine, the polio vaccine. New York Times is reporting this today, quote, the lawyer helping RFK Jr. pick federal health officials for the incoming Trump administration has petitioned the government to revoke its approval of the polio vaccine. That campaign is just one front in the war that the lawyer, Aaron Siri, is waging against vaccines of all kinds. In fact, Aaron Siri is a critical player in the anti-vax movement, or what RFK calls the medical freedom movement. New York Times adds that Siri is representing a group in, quote, petitioning the FDA to pause distribution of 13 other vaccines, including combination products that cover tetanus, diphtheria, polio, and hepatitis A, until their makers disclose details about aluminum, an ingredient researchers have associated with the small increase in asthma cases. Before we go any further, we should be crystal clear in stating the established facts and science. Siri is fighting to revoke use of vaccines that save lives. That's it, full stop. On the polio vaccine, the CDC says that just since 1988, quote, an estimated 20 million people who would have been paralyzed by the disease are walking, and more than 1.5 million lives have been saved. Prior to the vaccine, the World Health Organization says that 500,000 people were killed or paralyzed by polio every single year. But since we're doing this, in the second Trump administration, for them, those facts, that history, that established science around vaccines appears to be going by the wayside already. New York Times reporting this, quote, Kennedy has privately expressed interest in having Siri serve in the Health and Human Services Department as in the top legal job. as the general counsel. Katie Miller, a spokeswoman for Kennedy, said Mr. Siri has been advising Kennedy. Now, should RFK be confirmed by the United States Senate, all signs point to an HHS that is a dramatic departure from every previous administration, be it Republican or Democratic. An op-ed in the Wall Street Journal points out the contradiction in a Republican president appointing someone like RFK, saying this, quote, prior to Kennedy's endorsement of Donald Trump, the GOP universe was clear-eyed about the radical environmentalists who spent decades on a mission to destroy the Trump base. An online search finds pages of stories of Kennedy's efforts to cripple farmers, ranchers, loggers, and oil workers. Others outline his disdain for markets, core freedoms, and limited government. The Wall Street Journal op-ed goes on to urge that Republican senators, quote, save the president, as if that's their job now, as if the dynamic in the Republican Party during the entire Trump era of politics hasn't been complete subservience to Donald Trump. And the truth is, Trump appears to like RFK and share his skepticism about vaccines. While he defended the polio vaccine in an interview with our colleague Kristen Welker, he told Time magazine he could get rid of certain vaccines, saying this, quote, if I think it's dangerous, if I think they are not beneficial. We should note, all vaccines administered in the United States go through an extensive approval process with multiple rounds of trials. Trump adding this, quote, the autism rate is at a level that nobody ever believed possible. If you look at things that are happening, there's something causing it. Peddling, amplifying, platforming a now widely debunked conspiracy theory linking vaccines to autism. It's simply not true. But what RFK and the company he keeps says about the future of public health in this country is perhaps the biggest storm heading our way. And it's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Critical care physician, professor of pediatrics, and pediatric disaster response expert, Dr. Michael Anderson is back with me at the table. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend. Alicia Menendez is back, and president of the National Action Network, host of Politics Nation, right here on MSNBC. The Reverend Al Sharpton's here. Dr. Anderson, just start by telling us what polio is and how and when it was eradicated.
Yeah, it's a viral disease that causes massive paralysis. And by paralysis, I mean not only your extremities, but your ability to breathe. And I start off these conversations by saying, how many people do you know that have had polio? My grandmother, God rest her soul, had polio. We have eradicated this disease from the United States and from most of the world. It is a devastating, life-taking, life-threatening disease. And I love that CDC information that shows how many lives have been saved by this safe, very effective vaccine. Also in the New York Times, I think yesterday, was almost a primer for physicians reminding them of these vaccine-preventable diseases, how deadly they are, and how horrible it would be, specifically for kids, but really for everybody, if these diseases came back. So polio is one example of a horrible disease that we have eradicated because of vaccines.
And does the vaccine need to go away? And we should be clear, they're petitioning to get rid of it. But it seems that simply non-adherence to a vaccine schedule could expose some kids to risk. Can you talk about what the vaccine protocol is like and what the risks are if it isn't adhered to?
The risks are very, very high. You look when we have measles outbreaks where communities, for some reason, have marked decrease in the MMR vaccine uptake, and you get an outbreak of measles. So if we have kids, large numbers of kids that aren't vaccinated, there is a very high probability that, yes, indeed, polio will come back and potentially spread. So it's almost just insane that we're having debates about safe, effective therapies that have eradicated life-threatening diseases at a time when we really need to protect our kids. And it's a very, very safe vaccine. As I say, just one example of vaccines that save lives.
This individual, Dr. Aaron Siri, did some podcasts. It's just about all the Trump picks have done. Let me play a little bit of that for you.
so much to talk about, but really I just want to look forward. I want to look at the cases that we have going right now, because we could sit here and do, happy dances over all that's been achieved, but it's not over. Let me ask you this question just to start out with. I think a lot of people are going, well, it looks like, the government, Bobby Kennedy's taking the government. Why are legal cases going to even be important? Why not just say we did it, it's over?
Oh, absolutely. Well, to the extent that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is able to really rein in these federal health authorities, and we're talking within HHS, you've got 85,000 employees, $1.7 trillion department, 13 operating divisions, CDC being one of them, FDA being another, numerous offices of the Secretariat. It's a sprawling, massive behemoth. And I think if anybody could do it, I hope that Mr. Kennedy, we hope to soon call him Secretary Kennedy.
So the plan to take over the CDC and the FDA was the plan all along. Trump has gone along with it and amplified some of that debunked conspiracy theories tying vaccines to autism. What's happening right now in the medical community? Are physicians being retrained in how to spot cases of polio and measles if this goes into place quickly?
I'm sure we will get to that point. Once again, that New York Times article was almost a slap in the face of, I have to remember what measles look like. I have to remember how to diagnose polio. These diseases have been eradicated. And let me just take one other sidebar for a second. I have wonderful pediatric friends and colleagues that work at the FDA, that work at NIH, that work at CDC, and they wake up each and every morning trying to make this a safer world for children. And it is offensive to think that some sort of massive cuts are going to make kids healthier again. We have so many programs that have improved children's lives, including vaccines, that we need to keep moving forward and address a number of different healthcare issues.
Vaughn, let me play some of your interview with RFK on these issues.
You have been a crusader on questioning vaccines. Are there specific vaccines that you would seek to take off the market?
Oh, I'm not going to take away anybody's vaccines. I've never been anti-vaccine.
You will not take any vaccine that is currently on the market.
I'm not. If vaccines are working for somebody, I'm not going to take them away. People ought to have a choice, and that choice ought to be informed by the best information. So I'm going to make sure the scientific safety studies and efficacies are out there, and people can make individual assessments about whether that product is going to be good for them.
Mr. Siri has turned that into a lie. Mr. Siri is petitioning the government to take the polio vaccine off the market. So are Mr. Siri and Mr. Kennedy close?
Yes, but I think that this is where I think the confirmation process comes into play. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., before he can take over the FDA and the CDC, must get confirmed. And it's not just Democrats who are concerned about his position on vaccines. Republicans, too, still by and large in the United States, people trust vaccines. And in order to get confirmed, he needs the support of U.S. senators. At the same time, what I think is so interesting about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a political figure and a soon-to-be government official, in contrast to other nominees of Donald Trump, is that he is somebody who has not shaped and molded himself over the years. He, for decades, has been fighting vaccines and been openly discussing, writing books, questioning the science that has been peer-reviewed consistently time and again, that has said the vaccines on the market today are safe. And that is where Donald Trump's deference to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is also unique. Donald Trump claims to really be the smartest guy on most subject matters. And if you listen to his interview with Kristen Welker over the weekend, he reiterated this to Time, is that he was going to listen to Bobby Kennedy and to see what Bobby Kennedy came up with on vaccines, and that Bobby Kennedy would then come to him with what he thinks should happen to vaccines that are on the market. And I think that is what is so interesting about Bobby Kennedy, is that he has been so staunchly skeptical of vaccines historically, and that once he were to get into that government position, I think there's little reason to believe that Donald Trump, based off of his own words, would not take his advice.
According to the latest tally by Media Matters, Donald Trump has selected more than a dozen former Fox News hosts, personalities, and staffers to be in his incoming administration. Most infamously is former Fox and Friends weekend host Pete Hegseth to run the Department of Defense. There's also former Fox weekend host and Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee to be the United States ambassador to Israel. Former Real World reality star and Fox Business host Sean Duffy as his choice for Secretary of Transportation, among many others. At one level, now this is really surprising. It's long been clear that Fox News is basically Trump's entire mental universe. He spends most of his waking time consuming cable news all day, every day. And he wants all his favorite friends from the TV to staff his White House. I gotta say, though, I'm surprised by one particular Fox alumnus that Trump chose to serve his administration from really far away. On Tuesday night, Trump announced that he would be appointing Kimberly Guilfoyle to be his ambassador to Greece. Now, Guilfoyle spent more than a decade at Fox News before she abruptly left the network, apparently over claims of sexual harassment, which she denies. In a statement, Trump wrote, quote, Guilfoyle's extensive experience in leadership in law, media, and politics, along with her sharp intellect, make her supremely qualified to represent the United States and safeguard its interests abroad. Adding, congratulations, Kimberly. Now, many people's first reaction was, whoa, is he really sending his own son off to another continent? After all, Trump Jr. has been engaged to Kimberly Guilfoyle for years. But there's been no mention of Don Jr. following her to Europe. Appears he won't be going. This comes amid much speculation in the tabloids that the happy couple has indeed split up. As the New York Times put it rather diplomatically, the announcement came as Donald Trump Jr. has been seen with the socialite Bettina Anderson in Florida. So, as far as we can tell, Kimberly Guilfoyle will make the 5,000-mile journey to live in Greece as the American ambassador, and Don Jr. will just kind of do his thing here. Honestly, it's still a pretty sweet soft landing, and ambassadorship is an enormous deal. You get to carry the title for life. There are certainly worse places to be sent than Greece. And if we know anything about Kimberly Guilfoyle, she is nothing if not an optimist.
The best is yet to come.
His interview with Time Magazine, conducted late last month for Time's Person of the Year, which he was named yesterday. Donald Trump did not give a clear answer on whether he would allow his pick for Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to end childhood vaccine programs. Trump also appeared to draw a false link between vaccines and autism, one that's been debunked many, many times over the years, telling Time, quote, "We're going to have a big discussion. The autism rate is at a level that nobody ever believed possible. If you look at things that are happening, there's something causing it." When asked directly if he believes vaccines are linked to autism, Trump answered in part, "I'm going to be listening to Bobby," referring to Kennedy, who has promoted those debunked theories connecting autism to vaccines. Trump went on to say he would be willing to get rid of some vaccines if he thinks they are unsafe. When pressed again on whether he agreed with RFK Jr.'s discredited belief that vaccines are linked to autism, Trump answered in part, "I want to see the numbers. It's going to be the numbers," and claimed his administration will be conducting studies, adding, quote, "We will know for sure what's good and what's not good." Let's bring in former chairman of the Republican National Committee, now co-host of The Weekend on MSNBC, Michael Steele, and NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. Good morning to you both. Vaughn, I want to start with you because you conducted a memorable interview with Bobby Kennedy Jr. just a couple of weeks ago where you asked him many of these same questions about his plans for vaccines, his plans for fluoride in the water. Just to remind our viewers where he stands on some of that stuff, and that it won't be like a waving of a wand if he does become Secretary of HHS to just get rid of these vaccines.
Right. There's going to be a lot of layers of bureaucracy that it'll take for him to wade through in order to pull that off here. But I think one interesting note about Bobby Kennedy is the fact that Donald Trump is usually not deferential to others. He usually is pretty convinced about knowing the answers himself. And over the course of the last month, we have consistently seen from Donald Trump him saying that he'll leave this into the hands of Bobby Kennedy to essentially tell him what to do, in which direction to go. And since Bobby Kennedy Kennedy was nominated to be HHS secretary. We also have to pay attention to Dave Weldon, who was nominated by Donald Trump to take over the CDC. Kennedy and Weldon go back to the early 2000s, in which they would reference each other's works, pointing out the idea that there was a preservative in vaccines that was the cause and the link to autism. Of course, peer-reviewed scientific research has consistently shown an inability to find such a link. At the same time, Kennedy is being put atop and being put within proximity of the next president of the United States. Yesterday, on the floor of the stock exchange, I was covering Donald Trump as he rang in the bell, and who was there with him? Bobby Kennedy. And so there is an access to Donald Trump and an openness that is, I think, particularly unusual from the incoming president, an openness to somebody else's opinion and ultimate word on policy that should be enacted. And that's a lot of power that Bobby Kennedy could be potentially yielding in the months ahead.
So, I mean, some of the stuff that is being said now obviously is not quite what was being said out on the campaign trail, and it's perfectly normal that people have to, Michael, modify their language. But when Republican senators who seem to be under a huge amount of pressure to confirm these nominees actually start going into the process, I've heard that Bobby Kennedy is maybe fine because he has some Democratic support. But when some of these more controversial more controversial candidates are being put forward, do you think when we get into the nomination process, we're going to see Republican senators push back a little harder against Donald Trump than we're seeing them push back now?
No. No. We won't. I mean, look, there's going to be the
so he's going. You think he's going to get everybody through?
There may be one sacrificial lamb out of the trifecta, you know, that everyone's talking about.
Who do you think it's going to be?
I don't know. Probably Tulsi Gabbard, because that's something that strikes a little bit closer to Republicans on the national security, national defense side. The DOD and Hegseth, you've heard some warming as you guys talked about in the last hour to him. Certainly Bobby Kennedy. That's more about, you know, for Trump, his tie now to the Kennedy legacy more than anything else, and so that probably won't get touched, even though I wouldn't let him within a 10-foot pole of a child with an illness. But you know, here we are. The reality for Republicans does kind of boil down to how much moxie are we going to show that we're willing to assert against a president that is putting up wholly incompetent individuals to serve in the capacities for which they're being asked to serve. The advise and consent portion of this, instead of advising the president, could you send us somebody better so that we could consent to that? There will be the typical haranguing and hemming and hawing, but ultimately bending the knee to his choice. They'll pick one, and everyone will pat themselves on the back and pretend that they did the right thing. And meanwhile, you'll have Hegseth probably over at defense. And you know, someone like Kennedy running the nation's health system. And everyone will just turn a blind eye and wait till the chandelier crashes to the floor or a table gets knocked over and people start complaining about what the hell are these folks doing. So that's the reality that I think, you know, everybody wants to play, you know, the typical Washington game in the lead up to the inauguration, that, you know, we're going to look closely at the president's choice. No, you're not. No, you're not. And you know you're not. And these are some wholly difficult and incompetent people that are being asked to serve in these positions. We all know that. We see the thing in front of us. And yet we pretend that it's going to turn out to be something completely different. And yet we know that's not true either.
Yeah, so many of these candidates have deeply questionable qualifications. We should note the lead story on the New York Times app right now is about how Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s top aide, his lawyer, a man named Aaron Siri, has asked the FDA to revoke the approval of the polio vaccine. So that is something that we could perhaps be looking forward to if RFK Jr. was to be confirmed.
New Associated Press polling shows overwhelming distrust of President-elect Trump's pick of Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. In this poll, only 21% of Americans support her becoming Trump's principal advisor, coordinating the nation's 18 intelligence agencies. Gabbard has never worked in the intelligence community. She's never been on one of the committees in Congress. She's facing pushback on Capitol Hill, also for embracing Russian propaganda about Ukraine, questioning U.S. intelligence assessments, and meeting with now ousted Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad. Gabbard is now the focus of a New York Times op-ed this week, headlined, "Running Spies is Not a Game for Amateurs." This opinion piece was written by General Michael Hayden, a decorated Air Force veteran who was director of both the NSA and later the CIA, appointed by Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. His co-author is John Cipher, a retired top-level CIA officer who ran CIA operations in Russia, and John Cipher joins me now. Thank you very much for being with us. It's a very impactful piece, obviously, General Hayden, and you both so highly respected. And you predict that Gabbard's confirmation and Kash Patel's as FBI director could combined jeopardize not only our relations with foreign partners, particularly the Five Eye, our key five partners, but also risk Washington's vulnerability, our vulnerable human spy network. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of the intelligence that the U.S. intelligence community gets is from working with foreign partners, and not just allies. We work with foreign partners around the world to give us insights into what's happening in their countries that we can help protect the American citizens with. And frankly, there's going to be concern if the people they work with are not trained professionals that are just looking out for the health and national security, but also, partisans and working for one political party or the other. In fact, we recruit sources around the world who are frustrated with their own government's cronyism and corruption and those type of things. And so if Ms. Gabbard or Mr. Ratcliffe at CIA or Kash Patel, they use this populism to get themselves into power with these false narratives. If they then choose to, run these organizations as professional organizations, the organizations will work hard for this new administration. But if they continue to disparage the workforce, it's going to be a difficult challenge for them.
Is there any way the intel community can push back if all 18 agencies agree on a particular piece of intelligence and Gabbard, as the DNI, disagrees? She can change the PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief. She appoints the briefer. So she has an enormous impact on what the CIA produces, but she's in between what the CIA is assessing, the pros, the professionals, and what gets presented to the President of the United States.
Right. I mean, there's just a massive amount of intelligence coming in every day. So her ability to control all of that is going to be limited. However, there's going to be things, obviously, that President Trump is one of these people who wants to hear only what he wants to hear. Most leaders, they want their assumptions challenged so they can make the best policy. And we've learned that President-elect Trump is not like that. He wants loyal people to tell him what he wants to hear. And so I think Gabbard and Ratcliffe and others plan to do just that. But the intelligence is used not just for the president. It goes to the Secretary of State, it goes to our ambassadors abroad, our military leaders around the world. And so I don't think that she'll be able to control all of those things or skew that kind of intelligence, but it's nonetheless a real concern.
What do you think are the misperceptions that both Gabbard and Patel have about the agencies that they want to run? And we should not underestimate the role of the FBI on counterintelligence and on counterterrorism.
Yeah, in many ways, the misuse of the FBI is more dangerous for the American people. Our intelligence agencies are focused only abroad and trying to provide the best intelligence for policymakers. The real problem here is, in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary put out their word of the year was post-truth. And the problem is, if you have organizations who are really focused on truth to power, but you have people who don't want to hear that truth to power, or even worse, nominees that have to accept a lie just to get the job. So if you have to accept the lie that 2020 election was stolen, for example, it's clear that truth is not the most important thing to you. And that makes it very difficult for organizations that are focused on trying to present the best information, the best facts to the leadership. It makes it a very, very difficult place for the intelligence community to be.